Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the 1,775 poems of the Johnson edition of the Poems of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to poem 12, The Morns Are Meeker Than They Were. Now, this is a fascinating little poem. Emily's always interested in the idea of the cycles of time and the ways in which the seasons will play that game. I think there's a tremendous influence from John Keats's To Autumn, and we'll talk about that one here. Our first, though, our assumptions are that you have been following our stuff at learnstrong.net down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've had some exposure to our introductory set of comments, and we just finished with poem number 11, I Never Told the Buried Gold. Now, this is one of a number of list category-like poems that Emily loves, and so we're going to be playing that game. This poem, as I said, will remind us quite a bit of Keats's To Autumn. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. We'll enjoy another reading of it. Why wouldn't we? And this is, one more time, we're going to say this, Emily's love of nature, where she'll move from being the observer to the participant. We're going to have fun kind of watching how she does this. Notice as well the construction of this poem is quite brilliant. The morns are meeker than they were, the nuts are getting brown, the berry's cheek is plumper, the rose is out of town. The maple wears a gayer scarf, the field a scarlet gown. Lest I should be old-fashioned, I'll put a trinket on. Now, I love Emily's voice, especially when she starts to play around with this satiric, ironic voice of hers. But let's work to get there. First of all, this poem was entitled Autumn, actually, in the first appearance in Poems of 1890, and with good reason, obviously. Notice, the morns are meeker than they were. Now, it's interesting that she would use the word meek, thus the meek they'll inherit the earth, is the Matthew 5 Sermon on the Mount line that clearly she's playing with. To talk about a meek morning is fascinating use of that word. I mean, as I have said so regularly, Emily's word choice is almost always going to be just beyond genius. And here, to begin with the word meek, and then to finish with the word trinket is going to be for us a question as to why, right? The morns are meeker than they were. In other words, the passage of time. Now, what do we mean by meek? Well, she's, of course, referencing the fact that we don't have these strong summer days. Now, these mornings are becoming increasingly more meek. That is to say, not so, maybe we would say, sun-filled and dynamic by virtue of the fact that autumn is upon us. Notice, the nuts are getting brown, and immediately we think of squirrels with nuts, right? And right away we get a sense, oh, she's talking about the fall, I got it. The berries, and then we're back to her physicality in her poems. The berry's cheek is plumper, right? In other words, everything is getting ready to come to its final fruition. And then notice capitalized, the rose is out of town. Now, much has been made by scholars of the fact that roses are often representative and symbolic of any number of things. Obviously, Eros comes to mind, no question. Notice, though, the irony of the rose is out of town. In other words, the rose has bloomed, the rose is now dead, we're moving towards fall, autumn, and there is no rose anymore. But notice it's out of town. It's like the rose took a trip and went on a train ride. It'll come back later, of course, in the spring, summer of the following year. By the way, notice that we've got brown, we've got town, and then of course we'll get to gown here in a moment. But there's a stanza break. The maple wears a gayer scarf. And this is interesting, of course, the idea of the maple leaf. Now the leaves are starting to change, and the field, a scarlet gown. Notice we're going to go from wearing gowns to wearing trinkets here in a little bit. By the way, notice that a gayer scarf, that is to say GS, and then notice scarlet gown, SG, the inversions that she plays with. And of course, the last words of this poem are going to go from brown to town to gown to on. She's going to mess around with the rhythm just a little bit. Now, about all of that list, in other words, fall is upon us, lest I should be old-fashioned, I'll put a trinket on. Now, this is interesting because in some ways, right, she's going to merge or bring together her own person with this landscape that she's been playing with. When we hit poem 39, we're going to come back to this phrase old-fashioned. That poem reads this way: "It did not surprise me, so I said or thought, she will stir her pinions and the nest forgot. Traverse broad forests, build in gayer boughs, breathe in ear more modern, God's old-fashioned vows." This use of old-fashioned, I think, is significant because much like we said about Walt Whitman, Emily recognizes she's living in a progressive time. She's not completely comfortable with that idea of a progressive time. In some ways, she's quite puritanical, in fact, in her views of modernity. And so here we'll be playing around with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of satire when she says, I don't want to be considered too old-fashioned. I need to change with the times, and clearly the times are now the fall. So I think maybe I'll put a trinket on. Now, this use of the word trinket is significant. When we meet poem 687 later in our study, we'll see this use of this word, but a far more solemn kind of context. It reads like this: I'll send the feather from my hat, who knows, but at the sight of that my sovereign will relent, as trinket worn by faded child, confronting eyes long comforted, blisters the adamant. Much different kind of tonal quality with her use of the word trinket. Of course, trinket here will just be some kind of insignificant piece of costuming to try to at least keep up with the times. Well, what exactly is it that Emily's doing here at 2A? I think that she's arguing that all of life is a certain kind of learning to let go. That is to say, also there's always going to be loss, and of course out of that loss will derive some kind of gain. At 2B, think about the rhyming of brown town gown, but then she'll play around with it with her last word of on. Hear the rhythms of this poem again. It's a fun poem to read out loud. The morns are meeker than they were. Hear it. The morns are meeker than they were. Then now the line of the next. The maple wears a gayer scarf. You can hear it, right? Then the nuts are getting brown. The field a scarlet gown. See how she's playing with the rhythms as well. Her study of Shakespeare's sonnets probably playing into this one. And then of course note again her humoristic, kind of satirist type of voice. Old-fashioned versus high-fashioned. She may be speaking, of course, to the idea that fashions have like seasons, their time and their place, and then off they go. Of course, Emily reportedly known for wearing just the white garment, not wanting to maybe try to fit in with high fashion, maybe making a bit of fun about how it's the new season. I wonder what I will wear, this kind of thing. We mentioned that so much of this poem, I think so much of this poem is really born off of her study of John Keats. As we said in our introductory comments, she loves Keats, and we got to go back to Autumn and just to remind ourselves, notice so many of the resonances and the echoes from this poem of 1820 that will, of course, be a significant, I think, poem about autumn for Emily. To Autumn by Keats. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run. To bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. And again, we've given full lecture on this poem at learnstrong.net, but notice some of the echoes that are there. I also like to think about the way in which Linda Luhman, speaking in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, will say to Willie, remember, life is a casting off, dear. It's always that way. And of course, Willie will come back to try to combat it, and yet the entire poem the point of that play is this idea that there is a casting, there is a releasing, a necessary releasing. That is to say, everything is cyclical. Finally, at 3B, to own a poem like this, what's the time that you gained through loss? And what are your feelings about the fact that for most of you guys, during your school years, your year actually doesn't begin January the 1st. It really begins sometime in August or September when we come back to school. And from the time you were 5 or 6, if not sooner, your life rhythms, yearly rhythms, were actually about beginning of school, end of school, beginning of school, end of school. And think about the ways in which that cyclical effect has been a part of your life for both, obviously, gain as well as loss. I'm hopeful that Emily will make you think newly again about the fall. What a great time of the year. Thank you.